There are things that a man never forgets, even when he wants to erase from memory. The sound of chains dragging in the dust is one of them. Thomas McCain watched the dusty road that stretched as far as the eye could see in the inclement midday sun. His calloused hands held the reins as firmly as always, but something different hung in the air on that August afternoon. The wind carried more than sand and the dry perfume of mugwort. It carried the weight of a promise he didn't yet know he would make. The cart approached slowly, swaying in the holes of the poorly traced road. The coachman, a man with hunched shoulders, kept his eyes fixed on the path, as if avoiding looking back. It was strange. Thomas knew that kind of posture. I knew it too well. It was the posture of someone who carries something heavy on his conscience. The sound came before the vision, a metallic tinkling that cut through the silence like a sharp blade. Thomas narrowed his eyes, adjusting his hat to protect himself from the sun's reflection. When the cart passed by him, he saw it, a young woman sitting in the back, dressed in a once beautiful white dress. The long sleeves couldn't completely hide what caught his eye. On her delicate wrists, iron chains made marks on her fair skin. She kept her head down, her dark brown hair covering part of her face, but Thomas could see enough. Silent tears ran down his cheeks. The wagon continued on its way toward the village of Cedar Ridge, kicking up a cloud of dust that remained suspended in the air for long minutes. Thomas stood there, feeling something awaken in his chest, something he had thought he had buried along with so many other things in recent years. It was a dangerous feeling for a man like him, a feeling that had brought problems before, but there, on that lonely road, watching the wagon disappear into the distance, Thomas McCain felt that some chains could not be ignored, especially when they were on the wrists of a bride who was crying silently. The sun began to decline over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. Thomas mounted his horse and followed the same path as the wagon. He didn't know exactly why. Maybe it was instinct. Perhaps it was something deeper. Cedar Ridge was one of those places that seemed to exist only for people to pass through it on their way to somewhere else. Few wooden houses, a tavern that served as everything else, hotel, restaurant and meeting place, and a small church at the end of the main street. It was there that Thomas saw the cart stopped. The young woman had gone downstairs and was walking slowly toward the church, escorted by the coachman and two other men Thomas did not recognize. The chains were still on his wrists, reflecting the golden light of the late afternoon. She stumbled once, and none of the men moved to help her. At that moment, Thomas McCain made a decision that would change everything. He dismounted from his horse and began to walk towards the small group. Each step in the dust raised small clouds that dissipated quickly into the dry air. The men noticed his approach. His hands instinctively moved to the guns, but Thomas kept his hands clearly visible, away from the holster. It was not the time for confrontation. Not yet. The young woman looked up for the first time, and Thomas felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. They were eyes as blue as the sky after a storm, but charged with a sadness that seemed to have no end. For a moment, their gazes met, and he saw something light up in those blue depths. Hope. It was a small spark, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and Thomas knew, with the certainty that only years of experience in the Wild West can bring, that this spark would change everything. For him, for her, to everyone there that afternoon that had become the beginning of something that none of them could have imagined. Courage is born in the most unlikely places, sometimes when we least expect it, sometimes when we need it most. Thomas approached the group with measured steps, his boots making a dull sound on the dirt of the main street. The coachman was the first to speak, his harsh voice cutting through the hot afternoon air like an old saw. The taller man, wearing a dark suit that contrasted with the rustic surroundings, looked Thomas up and down with barely concealed contempt. There was something about him that didn't suit Cedar Ridge. His hands were too soft, his face too pale for someone who knew the hard work of the West. Thomas stopped a few feet away, his hands still visible and away from the gun. His eyes were fixed on the chains that marked the young woman's wrists. Up close, she could better see the reddish marks on her delicate skin. They were not recent injuries. Those chains had been there long enough to leave their scars. The woman kept her head down, but Thomas noticed that she was watching him out of the corners of her eyes. There was something about her posture that intrigued him. It wasn't just fear. It was resignation mixed with a spark of rebellion that the chains could not extinguish. The man in the suit stepped forward, placing himself between Thomas and the young woman. His voice had a foreign accent, words carefully pronounced by someone who learned the language from books before living it on the streets. Thomas did not immediately respond. His eyes scanned the small group, assessing every movement, every breath. The coachman was fiddling nervously with the reins. The second, younger man, was sweating excessively for someone just standing in the shadows. But it was in the eyes of the man in the suit that Thomas saw what he was looking for. Cruelty. It was a cold, calculated cruelty, the kind that was born not of necessity or survival, but of the pleasure of causing suffering. Thomas knew this look well. She had faced men like this before, and she knew that words would not solve this situation. The young woman chose that moment to raise her head completely. Her blue eyes met Thomas's, and for the first time since he'd seen her on the road, she spoke. Her voice was soft, but there was a strength in her that the chains could not break. The words came out like a whisper, but they carried the weight of a desperate plea. Thomas felt something twitch in his chest. It wasn't just the words, but the way she said them, as if it were the last hope she had left. The man in the suit turned sharply to her, and Thomas saw his hand go up. The movement was fast, instinctive, born of an anger that seemed to be always on the surface. But Thomas was faster. His hand held the man's wrist in the air, preventing the blow. The grip was firm, but not violent, not yet. Thomas's eyes fixed on the stranger's, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Two wills faced each other in that silence charged with tension. The man tried to break free, but Thomas's grip was like iron. Years of working on the ranch, taming wild horses and herding cattle had turned his hands into instruments of controlled force. He didn't need to hurt to be effective. The young woman watched the scene with wide eyes, as if she could not believe what she was seeing. Someone had interfered. Someone had come between her and the man who was terrorizing her. Thomas let go of the man's wrist slowly, but held his position. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and controlled, charged with the authority of one who knew both violence and restraint. The wind blew down the main street, kicking up little swirls of dust that danced among them like silent ghosts. In the church at the end of the street, the bell rang a single chime, marking half an hour. The sound echoed through the almost empty village, a reminder that time was ticking. The man in the suit took a step back, but his eyes remained fixed on Thomas. There was hatred there now, a hatred that added to cruelty. Thomas knew he had made an enemy in that moment, but he also knew that some things were worth the price of an enemy, especially when it came to chains that shouldn't exist on anyone's wrists. There are times in a man's life when he has to choose between what is easy and what is right. Thomas McCain always knew this moment would come. The man in the suit stepped back a few more steps, his eyes calculating the options. Around them, Cedar Ridge seemed to have stopped breathing. A few curtains shifted in the windows of nearby houses, curious faces watching the scene unfolding on the main street. But no one approached. It was like that in the West. People learned when to get involved and when to just observe. Thomas maintained his position between the young woman and her captors. He could feel her eyes fixed on him, a mixture of hope and fear that reminded him of things he would rather forget. There were other women in his life, other times when he could have made a difference and didn't. Not this time. The coachman cleared his throat nervously, his hands shaking slightly as he held the reins. It was clear that he did not expect that complication. He had probably been paid to do a simple job, taking the young woman from one place to another. Now he found himself in the middle of a situation that could explode at any moment. The youngest man in the group took a side step, trying to flank Thomas, but the movement did not go unnoticed. Thomas had spent enough years in the West to develop eyes on the back of his head. He knew when he was being surrounded, even without looking directly. The young woman noticed the movement as well. Her chains jingled gently as she moved, placing herself slightly behind Thomas. It was a small gesture, but loaded with meaning. She had chosen her protector. The man in the suit finally spoke again, his voice controlled, but with a barely concealed threat running underneath the polite words. There was something about his accent that Thomas couldn't fully identify. European, perhaps, someone with education and money, but without the kind of character that the West used to forge in men. Thomas did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked around the small crowd that had formed. The tavern owner was standing in the doorway of his establishment, his arms crossed, watching with interest. Two men Thomas recognized as local farmers were talking quietly near the entrance to the church. And down the street, riding a horse, was the sheriff of Cedar Ridge. It was interesting that the sheriff had not approached. He was just watching, as if waiting to see how the situation would develop before deciding which side to take. Thomas knew this kind of authority, the kind that weighed political options before considering what was right or wrong. The young woman broke the silence. Her voice was stronger now, fueled by Thomas's presence by her side. She spoke directly to him, completely ignoring the other men. His words were simple but charged with a desperate urgency. Thomas heard not only the words, but what she wasn't saying. There was a story there. A story of suffering and resistance that the chains on her wrists only hinted at. He had seen women like this before, broken by men who confused power with entitlement. The man in the suit was annoyed by the fact that he was ignored. He stepped forward, his hand moving toward the inside of his jacket. Thomas saw the movement and reacted instantly, not with violence, but with a presence that filled the space between them like an invisible wall. His words, when they finally arrived, were uttered with a calm that contrasted with the tension of the moment. But there was steel in them, the kind of steel tempered by years of experience in the Wild West. Thomas had learned that sometimes the right words could be more effective than any weapon. The coachman began to sweat more intensely. She looked nervously between Thomas and the man in the suit, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. He was just a man trying to make a living, and now he found himself in the middle of something much bigger than he had bargained for. The younger man also seemed hesitant. His eyes moved constantly, weighing the options for escape. Thomas noticed that he kept one hand close to the gun, but there was not the cold confidence of an experienced gunslinger. He was someone dangerous because of his inexperience, not his skill. The afternoon was inching on, and the shadows began to stretch through the streets of Cedar Ridge. The hot air carried the smell of dust and sweat, mixed with the aroma of food coming from the tavern. It was a moment suspended in time, when everything could change with a single wrong word or move. Thomas looked into the young woman's eyes once more. He saw there not only fear or hope, but a determination that chains could not break. She was waiting for him to make the choice that would change everything. And deep in his heart, Thomas McCain knew exactly what choice he would make. There are times when a man discovers who he really is, when all the masks fall and only the raw truth of his soul remains. Thomas stepped forward, closing the gap between himself and the group even further. His eyes fixed directly on the man in the suit, and when he spoke, his words cut through the hot air like a sharp blade. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The young woman raised her head completely for the first time, her blue eyes shining with a mixture of surprise and relief. The man in the suit took another step back, his face contorting in an expression of anger and disbelief. Clearly, he was not used to being contradicted, much less by a simple cowboy in a city lost in the middle of nowhere. His hands clenched into fists, and Thomas could see the veins popping out in his neck. Thomas turned slowly to the young woman, his movements deliberate and calm. When their eyes met, he saw in them a gratitude so deep that it almost knocked him down. They were the eyes of someone who had lost hope and now saw it reborn before him. Unhurriedly, Thomas took a small metal tool from his shirt pocket. It was something that every man in the West carried with him, a little lever that served a variety of purposes. But at that moment, Thomas had only one use in mind for her. He approached the young woman carefully, as if she were a wounded animal that could be frightened by sudden movements. She stretched her wrists toward him, the chains tinkling gently in the still air. His hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. It was the trembling of hope. Thomas examined the chains carefully. They were heavy, made of solid iron, but the fasteners were not impossible to break with the right tool and enough strength. More importantly, he could see that they had been placed in such a way as to cause constant discomfort, but not permanent injury. It was the kind of calculated cruelty that revealed a lot about who had put them there. The man in the suit erupted in angry protest, his voice echoing down Cedar Ridge's main street. Threats were mixed with arguments about property and rights, words that made Thomas's blood boil, but he did not answer, not yet. Instead, he positioned the tool on the first of the latches and applied constant pressure. The metal protested with a low groan, but Thomas had broken tougher things in his life. The first stream opened with a dry crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silent afternoon. The young woman let out a sigh that came out as a sob of relief. He massaged his free wrist with his hand still in chains, and Thomas could see the red marks the iron had left on his delicate skin. They were marks that told a story of suffering that he didn't want to fully imagine. The second closing was more difficult. It was tighter, as if it had been closed in anger. Thomas had to use more force, and for a moment the tool slipped, almost cutting off his own hand. But he persisted, applying steady pressure until the metal finally relented. When the second chain fell into the dust at the young woman's feet, the sound it made was different from the first. It wasn't just metal hitting the ground. It was the sound of freedom. The young woman looked at her free wrists as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. He ran his fingers through the wounds left by the chains, touching his own skin as if it were the first time. Tears began to run down his cheeks, but this time they were not tears of despair. Thomas straightened up and turned to face the man in the suit. The broken chains lay in the dust between them like a demarcated line. On her side, freedom. On his side, the anger of those who lost control over something they considered theirs. When Thomas finally spoke, his words came out low but clear enough for everyone around to hear. They were not just words directed at the man in the suit. They were a statement to everyone present, including the sheriff who was still watching from the end of the street. The man in the suit stepped forward, his hand moving definitively towards the weapon hidden in his jacket. But before she could complete the movement, the young woman's voice cut through the air. His voice had changed completely. It was no longer the frightened whisper of before. It was the voice of a woman who had found her strength again, fueled by her newfound freedom, and the presence of someone willing to defend her. The words she uttered made the man in the suit stop in the middle of the movement. His eyes widened, and Thomas saw something in them that wasn't there before. Fear. The fear of someone whose secrets have just been exposed to the light of day. The young woman continued speaking, each word falling like a stone into the still water of Cedar Ridge. And Thomas knew that those words would change everything, not just for the two of them, but for the entire city he watched. The truth has a weight of its own, and when it finally comes to light, it can topple empires built on lies. The young woman continued talking, and with each word that came from her lips, the face of the man in the suit grew paler. She told of stolen property, of forged documents, of other women who disappeared without a trace. Her voice grew in strength and clarity, fueled by her newfound freedom and Thomas's protective presence by her side. The sheriff finally got off his horse and approached the group. His steps were measured, cautious, like those of a man who was beginning to understand that he had been involved in something much bigger and more dangerous than he had imagined. His hands rested on his belt, close to the gun, but not in a threatening way. Thomas watched the approach of the local authority with interest. I had seen sheriffs like that before, men who tried to balance the law with political expediency, often favoring those with the most money or influence. But he also saw in the man's eyes something that gave him hope: shame. The shame of those who realized they were on the wrong side. The coachman began to slowly retreat toward the wagon, his hands shaking as he tried to decide whether to run or stay. The younger man had already made his decision. He disappeared down the side street, leaving only a cloud of dust to mark his passing. Some men know when a cause is lost. The young woman turned to Thomas, and for the first time since he had seen her on the road, she smiled. It was a small smile, still hesitant, but there was a light in it that the chains could never extinguish. She reached out toward her, and when Thomas took it, she felt the strength that had hidden beneath all that apparent fragility. The man in the suit made one last desperate attempt. His hand moved quickly toward the gun, but Thomas was faster. He didn't have to draw his own gun. She just held the man's wrist as firmly as she had broken the chains, preventing any violent movement. The sheriff arrived at the group at that very moment, his authority finally manifesting when he saw the attempted assault. His voice cut through the air with the force of law, and Thomas let go of the man in the suit, allowing justice to take its natural course. The people of Cedar Ridge slowly moved out of their homes and establishments, forming a respectful circle around the group. Thomas saw in the faces around him a mixture of curiosity, wonder, and relief. It was as if the whole city had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. The young woman drew even closer to Thomas, and when she spoke, her words were directed only at him, though everyone could hear. His voice carried a promise, a thank you that went far beyond simple words. Thomas looked up at her wrists, where the marks of the chains were still visible as red reminders of the suffering she had endured. But she also saw there the promise of healing, the certainty that those marks would disappear over time, while the courage she had shown would remain forever. The sun began to set on the horizon, painting the Cedar Ridge sky with golden hues that spread like a blessing over the town. The shadows lengthened, but there was no more darkness in the young woman's expression. The man in the suit was being led to the local jail, his threats and protests echoing weaker and weaker down the main street. Thomas turned to the woman he had helped to liberate, and when their eyes met, he saw there not only gratitude, but something deeper, recognition, as if she had seen in him something that he himself sometimes forgot he had. That afternoon at Cedar Ridge, two souls found something they didn't know they were looking for. Thomas found that there was still room in his heart for the compassion he had thought he had lost in the hard ways of the West. And the young woman discovered that hope, even when it seems dead, can be reborn in the hands of someone willing to break chains. The iron chains lay forgotten in the dust of the street, but Thomas knew that other chains, those of fear, of loneliness, of disbelief in human goodness, had also been broken that day. Sometimes all a person needs is someone willing to say the right words at the right time, and sometimes those words are simply, "No one else is going to hurt you." The wind blew gently down the main street of Cedar Ridge, carrying with it the smell of freedom and the promise of a new dawn. Thomas McCain knew that day would change his life forever, and looking at the woman next to him, whose blue eyes reflected the golden light of the sunset, he knew that some changes are worth every moment of courage they require. If you enjoyed this exciting story of the Wild West, please leave your like to support us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our cowboy narratives and Western adventures. Turn on the notification bell and share in the comments which story you'd like to see next week.